guys, how's it going? My name is Dal. Since its release, so many players have been trying the Mage Tower challenge, but there's so many players that are still struggling with it to this day. Ever since I've gotten my Mage Tower mount, I've gone back to some of the other specs and playstyles to try different builds and try to find out which specs have it the easiest inside of the Mage Tower. While every single playstyle faces some sort of difficulty when doing their challenge, some specs just have it so much easier than others, whether it is mobility, survivability, or control, because of the base class toolkit. This inspired me to put a video together reviewing all 7 different Mage Tower challenges and which specs of every one of these challenges, in my opinion, has the easiest time. Of course, you should play whatever you're comfortable with, or whichever class you're the most knowledgeable about. Player skill is going to take you much further, because just swapping to a quote-unquote easier spec doesn't mean that the challenge becomes free either. But if you have any of the classes we mentioned today as alts and you are more or less familiar with how they play, you might be able to make some of these fights a little bit easier than having to grind them on your main. So let's get into my list, but first, most of you guys watch these videos are not subscribed, and if you're watching these videos anyway, you might as well hit subscribe as well as hit the bell in order to get videos like these as well as future World of Warcraft updates. First, we have the Xylem fight. The first part of the fight focuses on mobility and personal survivability. The second part is a boss rush that will require a little bit of AoE to deal with adds. In my experience, sub-rogues and arms warriors were the 2 specs that probably took the least amount of damage from frostbolts, unlike my Havoc Demon Hunter or Frost Death Knight, which seems to get shredded by the basic rotation that comes from Xylem. Both sub and arms warrior have great mobility to escape the frosty prison that Xylem would keep building around you. And both of them have fantastic mobility during their intermission, where Xylem teleports super far away, leaving after images for you to either shadow step to or charge to. You might be surprised that I actually put Arms Warrior for the survivability of the part 1 fight, but Arms Warriors are actually pretty tanky. The new improved version of the Impending Victor talent in 915 is huge for survivability, and you're constantly killing things like adds in part 2 or icicles in part 1, so you're constantly getting resets on that heal. You have Spell Reflect as well as Ignore Pain, so you're actually quite tanky compared to some of the other classes. Both sub and arms do well in part 1, but I think arms has an advantage in part 2. A good portion of this fight is having to deal with adds that spawn, and arms can deal with them efficiently with Warbreaker, Bladestorm, or even Sweeping Strikes. Just a couple of executes while Sweeping Strikes is on is enough to deal with some of those blueberry adds. The fight really does get tight at the very end because you are running out of space and you're trying to beat the boss health bar before you run out of space completely. Whenever the boss gets into the execute fight, this is where a lot of that easiness comes from. You're able to get through the boss, the last part, which is the hardest part, a little bit easier thanks to the warrior execute. The Sigryn fight emphasizes a couple of things. First of all, it's a cleave fight, so the better you can cleave on your class, the faster all the bosses die since all of them share health. It's a classic council fight. Mobility is also highly emphasized for this fight to catch all the runes. Damage is also emphasized to be able to deal with some of the shields that come up. Crowd control is very much emphasized to deal and shut down some of the bosses whenever they have their enrage modes. And it gets really hectic because of the survivability is always at question. Out of all the specs that I tried, I think Enhancement Shaman hits all those goals easily. You have great mobility with Ghost Wolf, so dealing with wounds is really easy. Defensively, you also have the Shaman Wall, which is one of the biggest defenses in the game. Or you can always drop down the Earth Elemental, which, while isn't a defensive directly, it does make the enemies hit a different target, which means that you're safe while the Earth Elemental is out. The crowd control is actually quite fantastic. I didn't realize this, but you can use Sunder in order to disrupt any of the boss's empowerments. So, for example, when Sigryn is casting her spell, if you hit her with Sunder, she just doesn't recast the spell at all. You can also sunder Jarl out of his Bladestorm, you can stun Jarl out of his Bladestorm with the Capacitor Totem, and let's not forget about Hex. What I'm trying to say is Shaman has plenty of crowd control to be able to easily deal with this fight. Let's not forget about the MVP of Shamans, which is Maelstrom Healing. If you ever wanted just to top yourself off, if you have a bunch of stacks of Maelstrom banked up ahead of time, you can always just hit yourself with a Healing Surge and just really stabilize out of a really tight situation. Then we have the Agatha fight, which is a fight that's a mixture of survivability, but mostly it's all about ad management. Agatha is going to throw a lot of ads at you, and being able to deal with those ads efficiently is going to be a top priority. While all of the fights in the Mage Tower are pretty difficult, and so is Agatha to some extent, this is probably the easiest in comparison to all of the other fights. I tried this fight as all the specs that can do it, but I felt that the Feral Druid had the easiest time with it. A lot of people complain about the Feral playstyle, and bleeds and the energy regen can definitely feel wonky, but I felt like the ads are scaled in such a way where they don't have enough health, and the Feral is able to bleed right through them and use swipes in order to get rid of them very easily. The Feral Druid also has a clear advantage in crowd control, between being able to root ads and knock them around with Typhoon. It just lets you deal with them far easier than some of the other classes. Like the Servant Imps, the ones that walk up to the boss and try to heal her, you could just root them in the back of the room for 30 seconds, and you can just keep spamming mass root them as much as you want. And what I usually did is put a root on them, put a bleed on them, and by the time they walk to the boss, by the time they break out of roots, they already have like no health, so you just hit them with one swipe and you're good to go. Feral also has great healing, so survivability is never an issue. You also have 3 extra yard range thanks to bounce affinity on your melee attacks, as well as extra movement speed just for being in cat form. So dodging boulders and putting yourself in a safe spot while still being able to reach the boss from a distance felt really good. The Fel Totem fight is all about crowd control, positionals, and survivability. I felt like for this fight, Windwalker was a fantastic spec. One of the biggest parts of the fight is just landing interrupts on Fel Burst. One of the bosses will cast Fel Burst, which needs to be shut down with a crowd control or hit with an interrupt. As a Windwalker, your interrupt is a short interrupt, as all the melee interrupts are, so Fel Burst was really easy to deal with. You're also very tanky between Karma as well as Diffuse Magic, Fort Brew, and self-healing. A lot of that healing comes from killing ads. Whenever you kill any of the ads, even the little totems that the boss puts down, all of them drop a healing orb. Running over the orb gives you quite a bit of healing, so this whole fight for part 1, you feel really safe. Quite a lot of this fight is an endurance fight, as you can stay in part 1 for a really long while, but the part 2 is just kind of like a boss rush where you're trying to kill the worm before he kills you. All you have to do is interrupt Sonic Screams. For Windwalker, I found part 1 to be the quickest out of the other specs that I've tried, but the part 2 can sometimes be risky. It's all about lining up leg sweep and paralysis to make sure that they're used at the last second of Sonic Scream. So that part I had a hard time with at first, but if you can get that down, then this fight ends up being a pretty quick fight for Windwalker in particular. Then there's the Twins fight with Karam and Raest. Normally, you would play your Affliction Warlock, put a Corruption on the final boss, kill the guy that chases you, outrange Raest so you can't Shadow Bolt you, and get into a nice spot where the ads despawn before they reach you. Blizzard since then has hotfixed this fight, so you actually have to play a lot of the mechanics. Because of this, Frost Mage is obviously the king for this fight. The obvious one is the crowd control, the kiting. Between blizzards, frozen orb, all the roots, Karam should never touch you. Frost Mage also deals with hands really easily. You can just root Karam while DPSing down the hands. You will always have an interrupt for every one of the hands, so it's far safer to deal with that part of the mechanic as Frost Mage in particular. If you're at the last part of the fight where Raest will drop down runes for someone to soak, otherwise a monstrosity will spawn, you can actually order your water elemental to go and soak those runes. And it does work and it does count for this fight. So your water ally can do the runes, you can kill the hands, and none of the ads can ever touch you. This is probably the best advantage you can get as any of the classes for this challenge. The tank fight isn't easy, and all the tanks have their own struggles and their own challenges to overcome, though I felt that there was a distinct advantage when doing this fight as a Vengeance Demon Hunter. The tank challenge is quite difficult, no matter which tank spec you end up doing it as, but out of all of them, I feel like Vengeance has the easiest time surviving part 1. This fight is notorious for its knockbacks, between the eyeballs that, if you don't stare into them, can knock you off the platform, between the infernals that can do this frontal that also knocks you off the platform. If you ever find yourself airborne, just press glide and then just float back onto the platform. It is so much easier and definitely has saved me out of really tight spots. You also have really efficient CC, together with your Sigil of Silence and Sigil of Misery, which applies a fear on the enemy, which is so good when dealing with nether horrors, which are super deadly if they ever get their cast off next to Valen. And I felt like I was tanky enough to take a couple of annihilates from Cruel in phase 2. The first time I ever did this challenge on Avenged Demon Hunter, I immediately saw phase 2 of this fight. The only thing that I felt was lacking from a Demon Hunter, and that could just be optimized, is the damage. This could be optimized with trinkets or changing up my gear to get a little bit more aggressive. This could be optimized with better play. This just might be me, but I found that it's easier as a Demon Hunter because since your survivability is so good, I can just focus on crowd control. I can focus on mobility. I can focus on positionals and doing damage. And while with bear form, I had to focus on all these things and it felt overwhelming. As a demon hunter, just having one less thing to focus on made the fight a little bit easier to process and get better at. Then the healing challenge, which I think is ultimately the hardest challenge of them all. Maybe because I don't play a lot of healers, but this was the toughest one of any of the specs and any of the classes that I played. Now, there's a lot of healers that can do the part 1, the part 2, and the last part of this fight just fine, but the comfort pick for me is going to be the Holy Paladin. In part 1, you have to deal with a lot of adds. There's a portion of the fight where you have to contribute to damage, but also you have to create opportunities for crowd control, so your allies are free to do all the damage in the world while you're keeping them alive. And when certain adds are chasing after you or casting spells that they shouldn't be because that makes your party die, it can be a little overwhelming. Holy Paladins in Shadowlands got the ability of Turn Evil, which lets you fear any of the undeads in the opposite direction, and when you're disrupting any of the soldiers as they're doing the knife dance, they are feared all the way to a corner of the room, then they fixate on you and they have to run with this fixate all the way to you, but by the time they reach you, the fixate runs out, so you're never really in any trouble from a single soldier that's fixating on you. This gives you opportunity to catch up on healing on your allies or contribute to more damage as your allies are hitting maybe a secondary target. If things really get bad, you can always bubble in order to make sure that you're all good, so always having that safety net of bubble just felt a little more reassuring when doing the fight. Then there's the damage of Holy Paladins, which is amazing. Part 1 becomes easier since you can contribute to killing the scariest mobs a lot quicker, a lot faster, so they're out of the picture quickly. The part 2 of this fight was also very damage heavy and it's timed, so you have 5 minutes to kill all the eyeballs that do a lot of AoE damage, kill all the demons, the archer that stands in your way. Because of this timed aspect, some of the healers I felt like it was really cutting close, but with Paladin I was never in any trouble. And again, there's parts where you can use bubble in order to just immune some of the outlandish damage that goes out for a short time, and it felt a lot better. The last part of the healer fight is very much a throughput fight. You're trying to keep your party alive while also trying to keep yourself at around like 30 to 40% health, but not above that because otherwise it does a lot of AoE damage. The final part of the healer fight is mostly a throughput fight. You're trying to keep your party alive while trying to keep your health bar between 30 and 40%. Not below that, otherwise you could die, but not above that, otherwise your party will die. So it's a very much a balancing act of a fight. Whatever free damage you can provide while you're healing your party helps, but it's more about managing as much space as you can, because over time the room is going to be filled up with green puddles everywhere. None of the healers should have trouble with this fight. If you play heal on a regular, this fight should be pretty okay, as long as you can mitigate as much room as possible. I found it personally difficult because juggling my health at 30 to 40% was very unnatural to me. The whole time I wanted to just top myself off, but that would cause my party to die, and that's just a wipe. Or if I kept myself too low, then I could just blow up out of nowhere. This is another part where bubble just came in handy in case I was just in a wrong spot at a wrong time or couldn't catch up with my health fast enough. You could just bubble, or you can even use things like lay on hands to top yourself off or top an ally off. And I felt like overall Paladins just felt pretty durable for this portion of the fight as well. Anyway, that's gonna be my full list of all 7 challenges of the Mage Tower and which specs I felt had the easiest time with it. Again, a lot of it comes down to personal play as well as the knowledge of the class, but if you are mostly familiar with some of these playstyles, they might make it a little bit easier when it comes to tackling some of these bosses and some of these challenges. Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you guys enjoyed this video or found it informative, give the video a thumbs up. I would very much appreciate it. And let me know in the comments if you are going to be playing the Mage Tower as any of these 7 specs we listed in this video in order to try to make the fights a little bit easier. Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see all of you in the next one.